I'm so glad to have Mark Pendergrast joining us today on the podcast because, Mark, I'm a big fan of your work. I spoke to you many years ago and I bought your book, The Time Warp, or The Memory Warp, sorry. Very much different than The Time Warp. The Memory Warp. And you had done so much work to bring light to the pseudoscience behind false memories, recovered memories. And then when I spoke to you, I was saying, do you realize that these are being repackaged and it's still continuing? And you said, yes, buy this book because I predicted it was going to continue. So tell us about, please, and also tell us about how it is you came into this work and what you've learned from it.
Well, in the early 1990s, there was a tsunami of accusations of either incest or sexual abuse by teachers or coaches or uncles, aunts, grandfathers, mothers, uh, satanic ritual abuse cults, including everybody's poker club or book club or bridge club. Um, there were accusations that uh, these people had babies and had them killed at birth and eaten. There were unbelievable allegations, and so I I had written a book and had become a relatively well-known writer by that point, and I just became obsessed with how could these stories come forth, and could they be true? Could some of them be true? Because you know some of them were completely outrageous and crazy, as the ones I described. Some of them were uh, quite possible. I mean, the idea was that, and it derived from Sigmund Freud originally, who came up with this theory in the 1890s. I think it was 1895, which he called the seduction theory, that primarily fathers were seducing and having sex with their daughters at a very young age, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that it had been so terrible that the children had repressed the memory. And Freud came up with this idea of repression originally, and that they couldn't remember it, and that this caused huge problems in their lives. And he said he had discovered this. And then he changed his mind and said, no, 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 this was all fantasy. It wasn't true. Uh, they were fantasizing having sex with their fathers because they wanted to, and he called that the Oedipus complex. And so I became very interested in this whole area of early Freud, and I've got to say that you should dedicate this show to Frederick Cruz, who did unbelievable scholarship on Freud and the harm he caused. And he wrote a final book called The Future of an Illusion. And Fred Cruz became a mentor and a major help to me in my work. He wrote a book called The Memory Wars, which basically included a long review of my original work on this. And Fred died about a month ago at the age of 91. And he remained an incredibly smart man who was dedicated to this cause and to the cause of a book I wrote about Jerry Sandusky, who was the Pennsylvania ex-coach accused uh, of predatory sexual abuse of all these young boys, which I became convinced also was not true. So that's another book you might look at. It's called The Most Hated Man in America. At any rate, Fred had written a lot about Freud, and I looked back, and then I looked back at Freud's original work uh, and his letters, and I realized that what he had done was to have a preconceived theory that he forced on his clients in the most outrageous manner. He called it his pressure method. At first, he tried to hypnotize people and get them to remember terrible things that had been done to them at a young age. And he wasn't very successful at that, although that is a splendid way to get people to remember things that never occurred. But he apparently wasn't very good at it. So he developed what he called his pressure method, which was literally to press down on people's foreheads as they lay on the Freudian couch and push on them until they revealed what he knew they must have buried in their brains. And then they would come out of it, and most of them would say, according to Dr. Freud, they would say, oh, it's true I said this, but I don't think it's true. I feel like I was just saying this because you told me I should. And he said, no, no, no. When they say this, you must tell them you're infallible and that you were right the entire time, and this must be true. So then when Freud changed his mind, it was also terrible and had a terrible impact on the prevailing culture of Freudian psychology for a long time. Because even when people were truly sexually abused, either by incest or some other method, and they came forward to the therapist and said, you know, this happened to me. They said, no, 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 it did not happen to you. We know from Dr. Freud that this is all fantasy. And so for years, people who recalled all too well having been sexually abused were ignored by the psychoanalytic community. So I'm probably giving you more than you need to know, but I think it's important background for this.
Sure.
Come on to the early 1980s, when people were beginning to come forward with true stories of sexual abuse. And with horror, our society was beginning to recognize that this truly did occur. And a guy named Jeffrey Mason, who has since written many other books, he wrote a book called The Assault on Truth. And he said, well, Freud was right in the first place. And we've ignored him and pushed it under the rug, and this is terrible and awful. It was ironic that he's the one who said this, because he had written a book very critical about the influence of psychologists. He wrote a book called My Father's Guru and various others. But his book had a terrible impact among many others. There was also a book called Michelle Remembers, which was published in 1980, which purported to be the story of how this woman named Michelle had recalled being in a satanic cult and all of the awful things that I told you about. And she told this to her psychiatrist, whose name was Lawrence Pasder. And they ended up writing a book together and getting married. And it's been completely and utterly debunked. But that was sort of the book that launched this whole craziness about satanic ritual abuse. So again, cut to 1988, when two women, Ellen Bass and Laura Davis, wrote a book called The Courage to Heal. And this was a book that was purportedly aimed at helping people who had been victims of incest to heal. And when I first looked at the book, I thought, oh, well, this is good. This is a book that could help many people, probably. But then I began to read it carefully, and I realized that the entire book was aimed not at people who recalled being abused, but at people who had symptoms of what they considered to be abuse. And those symptoms included things like having a bad relationship with your parents, parents who cared too much for you, who were, quote, emotionally incestuous, or parents who had been too revealing of their own sexuality with the children and who'd walk around naked with them, or parents who had been totally standoffish and had not touched them, or that a symptom of this was that if you had an eating disorder, it meant you probably had been sexually abused. If you were depressed, if you were too sexual, if you weren't sexual enough, if you felt badly about yourself, and many, many, many of these symptoms were things that almost everyone has in one fashion or another. So it was very easy when people walked into therapy and they presented with postpartum depression, an eating disorder, or sometimes bipolar disorder. Or panic attacks. Many, many therapists by 1990, let us say, particularly in Boston and Berkeley, were sort of the two centers on either side of the United States, they would say, well, were you ever sexually abused? And they would say, no. Or they would say, yes, I was. This guy in an elevator attacked me, or this terrible incident occurred when somebody fondled me when I was 15, or I was raped. And the therapist would say, okay, you don't remember anything, or you just remember this incident. But the fact is, you have all these terrible symptoms. That's why you come to see me. And in my experience, which is vast, most of the people who've come to see me have come to remember, and I have various ways that they could remember, having been sexually abused. And until they do remember, they don't get better. It's like this cesspool that's festering, or it's like a terrible splinter that got buried in your brain and that can't come out. And until you remember this, and until you relive the trauma, until you scream and yell and are fierce and say how much you hate whatever you're remembering, you won't get better.
So this type of sort of if I could put it, therapeutic paradigm, it's still somewhat applicable as we're seeing now, sort of rear its head again. What recently has, this is a very rich background to give us very important context, but recently we're seeing this resurfacing in various iterations, including learning about the neurobiology of trauma, trauma-based approach to understanding evidence. But we're starting to see a resurfacing again now over the last several years of this recovered or fractured memory. What's populated this so much now? What work has really led to this? And why are we seeing this now?
Well, again, let me say you're absolutely right. And there are a variety of reasons that it's happened. One of them is that young people don't remember any of this. Fred has died. I'm 75. Most of the people who went through this, and I was one of the younger people looking into it, are gone. And so they simply don't know a lot about how memory really works, which I should tell you as well. Also, you have the influence of the internet, which is just terrible. I mean, the reason that I updated my work and came out with Memory Warp, I had originally written a book called Victims of Memory, which came out in the mid-90s. And by the late 90s, there were many, many lawsuits that were filed against the most egregious and crazy psychiatrists. Bennett Braun, for instance, or Judith Peterson. There were a variety of people who had basically ruined the sanity of many of their clients, and convinced them that they had multiple personalities when they did not, and that they were in satanic cults. And these, a guy named Christopher Barden, a lawyer and a psychiatrist, brought a lot of lawsuits that were very successful for millions of dollars against these therapists. And so I thought, and almost everybody thought, that this whole notion of massive repression, that you could forget years of horrible things happening to you, was debunked and going away.
Right.
It turns out that that's not true. I compare it to a bloated corpse that keeps coming to the surface of the culture.
Yes.
Once it's in the culture,
Yeah.
it almost never goes away. And the fundamental belief of the public and the therapists, and seeing all these movies, because this makes a great movie plot of, remembering terrible things that had happened to you. The Three Faces of Eve and Sybil and lots of movies since then. It's become sort of part of the received knowledge of our culture. Also, there's a very well-known and very revered Boston area psychiatrist named Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote a book about 10 years ago called The Body Keeps the Score, where he says a lot of things that are reasonable and true, but a lot of things that are absolutely untrue and crazy. And he believes in massive repression. And he gives lots of examples of this in his book. And that is a bestseller. It has remained a bestseller and touted by public radio and television and psychological journals all over the world. And very few people have looked carefully at what he actually wrote in the book. So that's another reason that this has kept going. And let me just say, and it's also not a totally black and white issue. People can, of course, forget things, some of them pretty terrible, and then remember them later. And there's this thing called infantile amnesia, where nobody remembers anything before the age of 2.5 or 3, because your brain isn't, developed enough to remember this. And so a lot of the theory involves, maybe something awful happened to you when you were 2 years old or in the crib, and you remember it in your body. which is complete pseudoscience.
There's a couple of things you mentioned before I lose track of them. So the body remembers, and people using the internet and getting misinformation about memory and how it works and so on. There is a case in Canada that's currently under appeal where literally a person has said, and the accused people there's co-accused, were convicted because the complainant said that she was unconscious and yet her body stored memories. And when she was sleeping, she recovered memories because her body remembered, right? So these are the things, and this is why your work is so important, I think, because we have, we're going to courts and we're hearing this stuff in courts, and these people got convicted on the concept that a body, not the brain, a body can have memories that then it delivers to your brain when you're sleeping.
Well, I heard this. Classically, there were many ways that therapists help people to get memories back. One of the best ways was to tell them that they would dream about this, that if something terrible had happened to them, that their subconscious would reveal it to them in their dreams. And so if you are a troubled person and you are seeking answers for why you're so troubled in your life, and a figure of authority, the therapist, tells you that it is likely that this will come back to you in a dream, we're not going to push you, because that's terrible. We wouldn't push you to do anything, but it will bubble up. And so they would eventually dream about something, because we do dream about things that we are worried about and obsessed with in our lives. And then they would wake up and say, oh my God, it was true. The other thing is that there were a number of massage therapists who also had this belief that if you pressed on a particular place on someone's body and, gouged in the right place, that it would uncover this body memory, and you would cry and have this huge emotion. Well, people sometimes do have huge emotions when they're being massaged. Another method they had was to do guided imagery. They would say, well, we're not going to hypnotize you because that could influence you, but we'll take you to a safe space, and then we'll take you back in time to when you will do age regression, and so we'll picture your dad coming into your room when you were 5 years old, and after it was basically hypnosis, and so they would hypnotize people and get them to remember terrible things that way. And classically, this would be the way that people would recall past lives, would be the way people recalled being abducted by aliens. It depended on who believed it. And then it also has gotten to the point now where you don't need a therapist. It's become such a widespread belief in our culture that if you read a book that tells you how this probably could happen to you, or if you see a movie, or if you go to a group therapy session with lots of other people who have had their memories recalled, that became sufficient to trigger all of these things.
Well, we've had somebody who was attending a class in college or university, and they were talking about repressed memory and sexual abuse, and that's when they remembered. There was another one who was writing a story for their university class based upon some related topic which elicited. So you're right. It's embedded in our culture. It's embedded in our post-secondary education that these things can be legitimate memories, but they're not. And it's very frightening when you try and marry that up with the criminal justice system and what is reliability in order to convict somebody of a pretty heinous crime.
Well, it used to be that there was something, as you know, as lawyers, called the Fry rule, where basically you could only introduce an expert witness into a case.
Right.
It was a widely accepted concept at the time. Well, the problem is that, it was a widely accepted concept that homosexuality was a mental illness. It was widely accepted that you could perform lobotomies on people and make them better. There were all kinds of widely accepted and now totally debunked theories. So they then introduced the case called Daubert, in which
These are the U.S.
the
cases.
judge was responsible for trying to figure out, is there actual experimental and verifiable data to indicate that this is permissible, that you should allow an expert to testify. And so that became a fairly powerful way to have hearings before anything ever was accepted as going to court. And many repressed memory cases were thrown out on that basis. But now judges seem to have forgotten that too, in many cases. And let me mention something else. I think this is quite important. Back in, it was probably 2008 or so, I was trying to figure out, I'd always wanted to know how many of these cases are there? How many repressed memory cases were there where people came up with what were very likely to be false memories? And back in the early 90s, there were various studies that indicated that about 25% of therapists at that time were memory focused, that they were determined that most of their clients would get memories. And indeed, many of them, 80 or 90% of the people who came to see them ended up recovering memories of sexual abuse. And I did some, I took the number of therapists, I took the, number of clients they had on average, and I did some rough math, and I came up with over 1 million cases at that time. And everybody said, oh, you're crazy. That's, and that's not a scientific method. That's extrapolating from these rather small studies. I always wanted to do some kind of randomized study. And a therapist, an experimental psychologist named Lawrence Patihis, who worked with Elizabeth Loftus as a student, he did a study, a pretty widespread study of the attitude of the general public and of college students about a belief in repressed memories, of massive repressed memories, of forgetting totally years of things that had happened to you. And he discovered that an appallingly large number, a vast majority of regular public and of students and of therapists still believed this. So I approached him and I said, I wrote up this protocol to try to find out in the general public how many there were, but I don't know how to do it. It's very difficult to find people. He said, oh, there's this thing that Amazon does called Mechanical Turk, where you can ask people to fill in questionnaires. And I said, well, we have to be very careful doing this questionnaire not to attract only people who have repressed memories. So we should ask them things about, we should tell them this is a study of people who've gone to therapy. So if you're willing to, have you ever been to therapy? Okay. And during this therapy, eventually we would ask them, did you ever recall an incident of sexual abuse that you had never remembered before? Yes. Did you do this through therapy? Yes, etc. So we got over 2,000 people, ranging in age from like 18 to 91 or something. And I would have to go back and look at the whole thing. But it was absolutely amazing because what we found was evidence that if you extrapolated it, that several million people had gone through this. And let me just quote you some statistics from that. It was an amazing study. In the early 1990s, 18% of people who entered therapy retrieved abuse memories. Now, that's 18% of everyone who went to therapy for any reason whatsoever. 18%. And that was in the early 1990s. Well, I expected that. That didn't surprise me. What did surprise me was that the rate had declined, but it had only declined to 8% by 2010 or so. And so what we found was that this was still very, very widespread, but it had gone under the radar. Nobody was calling it repressed memory anymore. They were calling it dissociation. They were calling it simple memory retrieval. They were calling it, trauma-induced whatever, primal scream recall, or any number of other things. But it had not gone away. And we got, there were quotes from people. They could make comments. And so we got quotes like this. I saw what she went through. This is somebody who believed her friend. I saw what she went through when she saw her psychologist. Some things are better left alone, even though she believed it. Another wrote, my friend's memories impacted her greatly. She lost her custody of her children, lost contact with her family, and almost lost her mind. Another one said, I still have the feeling that maybe I'm making this all up. It is very disturbing and has impacted my life in very negative ways. Finally, we had someone write to us. My sister committed suicide 3 years after repressed memories were brought to her attention in 2011 through hypnotherapy. I am 100% certain that these memories were false. I was very close to my sister our whole lives, and we never experienced sexual abuse or molestation of any kind. But this therapist somehow convinced her that she was raped, molested, and sexually abused by multitudes of people, including our doctor and dentist, as well as multiple families. So I couldn't believe it. It hadn't gone away. It hasn't gone away. And, some of these places are like memory mills that happen.
Yeah.
Many of them were Christian-based. Still are Christian-based. Again, let me try to be very careful. I'm always very careful when I talk about this. Sexual abuse does happen. It happens all too frequently. 99% of the time, people remember it far too well. They have trouble forgetting it. That's what post-traumatic stress disorder really is. People can't get it out of their heads. And it can screw up their lives in many ways, and often does. But what I'm primarily concerned with are cases of massive repression where people are come to think that lots and lots of people did this to them, or that it happened to them over many years, and every time it happened to them, they woke up the next morning and they had completely forgotten about it. Totally forgotten about it. Well, that's simply not the way memory works, as I think Elizabeth Loftus has told you.
Yes.
It's extremely disturbing to me that people have largely forgotten this. So I came out with this book, Memory Warp, which I see. Can you read that the right way?
We can, yes. And we had the book here.
did have it.
We've had your book here. I just don't know where it's gone in our basement, but we've had it, yes.
Yeah, I think it's quite important because I talked about a lot of more current cases. And I also gave the whole historical background of all of this. And I expected that it would cause some sort of sensation, as my Most Hated Man in America book about the Sandusky case. And it has not. It's been very well reviewed, but it basically has not caused much of a stir at all, nor have I been interviewed by very many people about it. So I appreciate your having me on.
You've come to a very important point, and I think this is something we have to keep talking about because it needs more and more attention.
Well, also therapy is, good therapy is very important for people.
Absolutely.
It's not just sexual abuse that's causing family rifts.
Oh.
Something like 1 out of every 4 families in America has someone who has cut off all contact. Usually it's an adult child who's cut off all contact with the parents. Many of them don't know why. Some of them may be sexual abuse cases, but many of them aren't.
Right.
Many of them are just, we've become so hypersensitive to, quote, trauma, and to that you are entitled to a happy life, and nobody really has a totally happy life, that this has become incredibly widespread in our culture.
Sadly so. Well, thank you so much for coming on. This has been very, very interesting and helpful. Hopefully we can have you on again soon, because we're going to circle back to some of the studies that we want to look at and sort of deal with. But thank you. This has been incredibly helpful.
Thank you for your work.
And very nice meeting you, at least through Zoom.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a lovely evening. It was an excellent point they raised. We've often argued that real cases of victimization and abuse are things that are all too painful and are very memorable, and we've seen those cases. Again, we've always said, just like him, we don't deny that sexual abuse happens. We don't deny that physical abuse happens. We just say, given the way our practice has unfolded, we know that there's a disproportionate amount of cases that are false. And when we deal with memory cases, it troubles us a lot when we talk about the, whatever it is, the neurobiology of trauma and all that other stuff, that when you have the complainants come forward where they're complaining of a historical allegation, but they're bang on, they're bang on. And they remember certain hallmarks. I mean, there may be certain immaterial inconsistencies. But when it's this lack of memory and then this disjointed memory and it's fractured memory, whatever you want to say,
Body memories.
Well, that's just ridiculous. And the rest of it is highly problematic. And what he says, which is very interesting, is all of this other work debunking and criticizing it, because we started practice in the early 90s.
I remember the book.
Okay, so we remember this, and we remember
Courage to Heal.
Alan Gold was all over this at the time to debunk, the recovered memory and repressed memory, and we all
It's not to say that people are lying, and that's the important thing, is people actually come to believe these things are true.
Well, that's what's terrifying about it.
Because they have a misunderstanding about memory and how it works, and it's so easy to implant memories.
It is, but we really did think by early 2000s, a lot of this is just out of the way. Yeah. But then we had, sort of laxed expert evidence rules, which came back into much more controlled basis, but now it creeps in through other ways because you may not even need expert evidence for this. You just allow somebody to testify. And again, I'm curious to see what the Court of Appeal will deal with in
this upcoming body memory case.
Well, no, in the Hogarth case, with the expert who testified about about memory issues.
Right. Neurobiology of trauma.
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking about that for a long time, because
it's not a proven science. The neurobiology,
it's not.
Proven,
it's just not.
It's a theory.
And so I'm very curious what the Court of Appeal will do on it. So this was very interesting, and we've had Elizabeth Loftus on, we had Dr. Patias on. So we're trying to really cover this, but there's a lot lacking in the 2020s.
And this is a big issue because judges can't take judicial notice of what they think they know about memory or don't know about memory. And there's all this weird evidence, like in the case I brought up with the body memories. Yeah. The trial judge actually said at the time, okay, no, I understand, because there was an objection to when the complainant started talking about these body memories. She's like, no, I understand this is not an expert. She goes, I'm just interested in the language.
Let's hear her out.
And then
Yeah,
ended up deciding
right.
that it wasn't about the language. This
Yeah.
theory about memory.
I think
got
that truly is an
accepted.
aberration. I mean, the judges we've been in front of have been extremely analytical about not letting this junk and not letting absurd evidence enter into the analysis. But I'm curious as to what the Court of Appeal will do in these two cases, and I think we'll have him maybe back on once we get these decisions, and we'll send him to him because I think he'd be very interested.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
All right, I know that was a long one, everybody, but he gives this great history, and we've had now 3 memory experts, and he comes from a different background. He comes from a journalistic authoring background, so it's very interesting to have. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you like what we're talking about, please like, share, and subscribe. Send us emails with your ideas,
Suggestions.
because I've got about 4 or 5 we got to review and topics we're going to cover as we go forward in August and September and October. So there's some good stuff coming. Thank you.
Cheers.
Good night, everybody.
Right, cheers,
Ciao,
Tara.
ciao.